Hello again everyone, and today I have a pretty exciting new lens to test out for you all, the Canon RF 100-500mm f4.5 to 7.1 L IS USM. It's only for their mirrorless EOS R camera systems and not digital SLR cameras. It's the spiritual successor to Canon's super popular 100-400mm EF mount lenses, except with an even longer focal range and a considerably higher price, costing an enormous $2,700 or £2,800 here in the UK. This lens is in pretty short supply at the moment, so Canon kindly loaned me one of them for a couple of weeks for testing, although as usual this is a totally independent review. I'll be looking at the lens's strengths and also its weaknesses, and in case you're wondering, yes, I had to give the lens back to them afterwards. This lens's zoom range of 100-500mm makes it telephoto all the way, giving you fantastic reach for a lens that's actually not too big physically. One or two people on photography forums freaked out a little bit when this lens was first announced because of that dark maximum aperture of f7.1 at the end of the zoom range, which seemed unbecoming for an expensive Canon L lens, and you can see their point to an extent. But the truth is that the maximum aperture only gets darker than f5.6 when you zoom into about 380mm, so it's actually barely any darker than Canon's popular 100-400mm L lenses of the past. I like what Canon have done here. They've taken the winning formula of their 100-400mm L lenses and tacked an extra 100mm of reach on the end, while making the design of the lens barely any bigger than before and actually weighing a bit less. The zoom range of 100-500mm is brilliant, and I would much rather have that than one of the Tamron or Sigma 150-600mm lenses. This Canon design can be so much smaller and lighter and gives you a much wider angle at the wide end for more flexibility. This really does have to be the super telephoto zoom lens for people on the move. I can't imagine anything much better for taking on safari or whatever. And the justification for this lens's cost is that it's meant to offer you spectacular image quality throughout that extensive zoom range. Well, we'll be the judge of that in just a minute. Let's start by looking at its build quality. The lens is obviously quite big and heavy, but not considering its very long zoom range. I didn't have any problems fitting it into my camera bags or hand holding it to take pictures, although you should be aware that it weighs 3 pounds or about 1.3 kilograms, so it's not lightweight. A lot of the lens's body is made of high quality composite material and some metal, and it feels nice and tough, and it has this really lovely brushed finishing to it, which makes it pretty beautiful to handle. The lens is advertised as being well weather sealed, and there's certainly a generously sized weather sealing gasket around the rear lens mount. Then comes a white coloured customizable control ring, which clicks as it turns. Then we come to a heavy-duty metallic tripod mount with a clever design that lets you easily tighten, turn or detach it from your lens. Then we have a rubberized focus ring that turns extremely smoothly and works very responsively with the focus motor. Some good news is that the lens doesn't display much in the way of focus breathing, which is useful for video makers and means that you're keeping its long telephoto focal length whether you're focused closely or far away. Let's take a look at the lens's autofocus system now. As you can see here, even at 500mm, the focus motor is lightning fast, silent and accurate. That really is a dazzling performance, and no wonder. The lens has dual nano USM focus motors working inside of it, which combine the speed of a USM focus system with the precision of an STM motor, and as you can see, it really is the best available in the world today, and it works brilliantly well with Canon's eye autofocus system too. This lens is also fitted with image stabilization. Here's some footage at 500mm with stabilization turned off and now turned on. As you can see, it's not quite perfectly rock steady, but considering we're shooting at 500mm, it is doing pretty well. The lens's zoom ring is broad and rubberized, it turns smoothly, and instead of having a locking switch, its action can be moderately tightened using the control ring beneath it to prevent zoom creeping, a simple design solution which I quite liked in use. The lens has a 77mm filter thread, and it comes with a lens hood which is made of plastic but has quite a luxuriously smooth finish to it, as well as a window through which you can adjust any filters that you're using. You can also use Canon's 1.4x and 2x RF extenders with it, but only when zoomed in between 300 and 500mm. Still, a useful feature for any photographers wanting to get a little extra reach. Overall, it's 10 out of 10 for build quality here in just about every conceivable way. You can't really ask for more than this, although I wonder if the image stabilization could have been just a tiny bit more steady. Anyway, nitpicking aside, let's take a look at the image quality now. I'm testing the lens on a Canon EOS R5 with its full frame 45 megapixel sensor. At the widest angle of 100mm at f4.5, the lens is brilliantly sharp in the middle with good contrast and no colour fringing. And the corner image quality, almost as good, very nice. Stop down to f8 and those corners become just a little sharper. Stop down to f11 and a little softness does begin to creep in due to the effects of diffraction, but a good start though. Let's zoom in halfway to 300mm now. The maximum aperture here has darkened to f5.6. The lens is still as sharp in the middle as before though, which is great, and the corners also look brilliant, sharper than they were at that wider angle. They stay this sharp at f8, and at f11, again, a tiny bit of softness and lower contrast creeps in due to diffraction. And finally, let's zoom all the way into 500mm. The maximum aperture is now, of course, f7.1, pretty dark, but the image quality remains as brilliantly sharp as ever in the middle. And the corners look pretty awesome too, once again, great. You can't really stop down much darker than f7.1, although f11 looks the same as it did at wider angles. Well, that really is a very impressive and very consistent performance from the lens at all apertures and focal lengths, especially considering that we're working on a 45 megapixel camera here. These are the best results I've ever seen from a super telephoto zoom lens. Let's look at distortion and vignetting now. They are normally corrected by your camera, but you can turn those corrections off to see how the lens is really performing. At 100mm we see no real distortion, although vignetting is noticeable at f4.5. You have to stop down to f8 to see it clear up. Zoom in a bit to 240mm and the lens begins to project some rather strong pincushion distortion, and vignetting gets a bit worse. Zoom into 500mm and the distortion is still there, although vignetting has become a bit more gentle again. Stop down to f11 to see that vignetting go away. So you'd better leave your in-camera corrections turned on with this lens, although for a model with a 5x zoom range, it's actually no worse than you'd expect. Let's see about close-up image quality now. If you zoom all the way into 500mm, then the lens can focus as closely as 1.2 meters, bringing you very close indeed to smaller subjects. The other good news is that image quality is just as sharp close-up as at normal distances, so that's a great performance there. When it comes to working against bright lights, this Canon lens puts in a decent performance, displaying a bit less flaring than average and holding on to its good contrast. If you have a very bright light in your picture and hit it at a very particular angle, then you can provoke a sudden little flash of flaring, but that's hardly going to be a regular problem when shooting in the field. And finally, let's take a look at the quality of this lens's bokeh. Generally speaking, its backgrounds are impressively smooth in all but the most difficult of situations, so again, that's reassuring. Overall, well, my conclusion for this lens is pretty short and sweet. I believe this is the best, most accomplished and finely tuned super telephoto zoom lens probably ever made, and that's just as well, because it costs nearly $3,000. Is it good value for money? Well, is a Bentley or an Aston Martin good value for money? In some ways not really, I suppose, but the principle here is that if you want something that's appreciably the best in its field, then you have to pay for it, and aside from anything else, it's an enormously fun lens to use. So if you're a pro and you need the best, or even just a hobbyist who has a lot of money, then look no further, as this lens has to come highly recommended.